Velkommen to Elkhorn, one of the largest rural Danish settlements in the United States, and home of our authentic 1848 Danish windmill. Indeed, it is a real Danish windmill, moved here in 1976, reassembled piece by piece and restored to working condition. There have always been windmills in Denmark and across Europe, used as a source of energy. In Denmark, they were primarily used to grind grain. Bringing an authentic Danish windmill to Elkhorn became the dream of Harvey, a second-generation Danish-American. He saw it as a way to honor the area's ancestor farmers.
It started back in '69 when we were in Denmark the first time, and I got interested in the windmills over there in Denmark and the way they were deteriorating over there, and I thought it was a shame. And I got to thinking about Elkhorn here and the Kimmel community, and it being a large Danish settlement, that they should have one of them over here, because I knew it wasn't impossible to move things. Don't think you could find a better place in the United States.
He saw that the windmills in Denmark were deteriorating, and he was convinced they should be saved as a part of the rich Danish heritage. In 1975, Sorensen visited Denmark again. When he returned home, he was more sure than ever that he could bring a Danish windmill to Elkhorn.
The picture of a windmill, that was a beautiful sight for me, and I thought, I got to thinking about the Elkhorn Kimmel here. That's the largest Danish settlement in the United States here. Gee, wouldn't it look nice with one of those? And you know, one night I had a dream, and I had moved it over here.
Before long, Harvey had convinced his friends, and his dream project gradually caught on. The Better Elkhorn Club and many interested citizens and groups began promoting the project. In September of 1975, a letter from Denmark arrived with the news that a suitable mill had been located in Norra Snida, Jutland. The mill was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Julius Hansen. The mill itself was well over 100 years old, having been built in 1848. Parts of the mill had been damaged by fire in 1943 and then rebuilt, but it had not been operational for 10 years. Moving the mill would be costly. $11,000 to buy the mill, $14,000 to dismantle it, and $8,000 to ship it across the ocean. But within a few days, over $30,000 had been raised, and the dream was on its way to becoming a reality. A man was hired from Norra Snida to dismantle the windmill. Because of its age and condition, the dismantling process was slow and painstaking.
They hired a man over there to take it down, and he done an awful good job. And he marked every piece that was there with a little tag, which you can see on these cross pieces and the main beams also. He made a replica of it, and was boxed and put on top of the truck when it got to New York, and it come out here in a little box 8x8 on top of it. That was all the blueprints we had, and that was 1 to 10, and that is what we went to put it together with.
100 yards of concrete was used to build the foundation and walls that extend 12 feet beneath the ground and rise 14 feet above. Although each piece of the mill was numbered, it was still difficult to get pieces into place, as some weighed as much as 2 tons. Scaffolding was erected, and gin poles with block and tackles were used to pull the heavy beams to the necessary heights, where they were then secured with wooden pegs. Wooden shingles soon covered the 8-sided mill, and then the difficult task of positioning the fantail and sails began. Before the cap of the mill was placed into position, the countershaft was lowered into the mill. The fantail is attached to skids, which are geared to track circling the neck of the mill. The fantail acts like a wind vane, always moving slowly around the neck to automatically face the sails into the wind. This is the wind shaft. Some of the teeth on the brake wheel needed to be replaced because of the mill's age. Once repaired, the 2.5-ton wind shaft and brake wheel were hoisted into position by a crane. After the fantail assembly, the next step was to add the cap. Here you see the gracefully designed shingled cap in place. Now all that remained was to add the sails, and of course, wait for the strong winds. Meanwhile, work began on the mill house. Originally, these structures alongside the mill were used to store grain and brought in by farmers. Because a miller couldn't always depend on the wind, he stored the grain in the mill house, and then he could work around the clock when the wind blew. You can see that the sails of the mill were still missing. Well, when the mill arrived in the United States, the original 66-foot sails were too long to transport on the highway, so they had to be cut in half. To build new ones, special fir timbers were ordered from the state of Washington. The 6-foot tips were salvaged from the original sails and spliced to the new sails. The warping and shaping of the sails and the 80 cross shutters took 2 months to complete. Each shutter was made with its own bracket, installed, and checked for fit. Finally, the sails were completed, and on the morning of November 14th, 1976, the 2 long crossbeams lay on the ground, ready to be lifted into place. Each beam weighs 3,500 pounds. A crane lifted each beam that was gently coaxed into position through the openings on the wind shaft, just as if threading a needle. Once the crossbeams were in place, the shaft which would adjust the shutters was inserted. Next, the shutters, which had been fitted and numbered, were affixed to the sails. 3 days later, on November 17th of 1976, exactly 1 year after the ground was broken for the project, the sails of the windmill turned in the wind. Next, work began on the interior of the mill, with installing the millstones and drive gears.
There's 2 stones that do the grinding. The bottom stone or bed stone is stationary, that rests on the floor. The top stone does the grinding. That weighs in the neighborhood of a ton, is about 14 inches thick. And you can raise the lower of that, coarser fine grinding. We try to keep rye, wheat, and corn here at all times in small sacks for souvenir. When you hear the noise up there, that's the wind changing, and that's the creaking old mill.
In 2012, an interesting artifact from the historic windmill, the official miller's record book, was given to the museum mill manager, Lisa Riggs.
We recently came across the miller's book, and we didn't know there was such a thing. And it actually, every mill had a miller's book where the miller kept records of what he ground, what kind of grain he ground, who the customer was, who bought what, how much they owed, and how much they paid. It consists of records from 1912 to 1947, and it was from the last miller of the Norris Nita Windmill.
Since the mill opened in 1976, several major restoration projects have been undertaken to ensure that the mill stays in working condition, and several other historic attractions have been added to the mill complex. This is the Viking Yum, a replica of a 900 AD Viking smithy's home and workshop. Continue along the interpretive path to see the tiny Morning Star Chapel, the Ebeltoft village, built by Danish immigrants, and a bust of the famed Danish storyteller Hans Christian Andersen. The Windmill Museum is a non-profit organization and all of this work was completed through community support and generous donations. The proceeds from the gift shop support the programs and daily upkeep of the Windmill Museum. In 1987, the museum and mill were designated an official Iowa Welcome Center, and 3 times since its opening, the Danish Windmill Museum has been named the Iowa Tourism Attraction of the Year. Yes, Elkhorn is a vibrant community that celebrates its Danish cultural heritage. Join us for one of our folk festivals. Enjoy traditional Danish dining and see the famous Mermaid Fountain in nearby Kimballton. The iconic Danish windmill graces our skyline and welcomes visitors from around the world. We're especially glad that you visited us. We're exceptionally proud and eternally grateful that Harvey Sorensen's impossible dream came true.